Hi guys, Zak here from Vortex Martial Arts and Fitness, and we're here today on our third beginner's iChuck lesson, Learn Nunchucks Online. In this lesson, we're going to be covering hip redirects, transitioning from our shoulder redirects, and we're also going to add a cool little spin. So get those nunchucks ready guys, because we're about to begin. So where you should be at the moment, if you followed lesson 1 and 2, you should be able to hit that figure of 8 pretty easily by now. Also, from that second lesson, you should be able to hit those shoulder redirects and into that figure of 8, and then at the end, that catch. Make sure guys, before you progress with this lesson, that you're really fluid with those shoulder redirects, really fluid with that figure of 8, and that you're nailing that catch. In today's lesson, we're going to be practicing transitioning from the shoulder redirects into our hip redirects. Once we got the transition, we're going to add that spin in. So from our shoulder redirects, we're going to be hitting hip redirects and adding that cool spin. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to look at guys is that over the shoulder redirect transitioning across to the hip. What we want to look at doing is coming from that shoulder redirect and striking in a diagonal motion across the body. Put your hand out here, okay, and put it into your hip. Practice with the shoulder redirects. When we come in the over shoulder redirect, strike across and catch. So what it'd look like is we're just on the shoulder, strike across, catch. Shoulder, catch. So we're starting on the shoulder, striking across the body and catching it with our opposite hand. So once you're comfortable with that transition across the body from that shoulder, over the shoulder redirect and across the body into that catch, once you're comfortable with that motion, we're going to move this hand out the way and we're going to leave it wherever we feel comfortable. And we're just going to strike across the body without the hand being there. What we're looking at doing guys, as we come down, we're going to look at pointing the chuck towards our hip. So we're aiming the chuck. As it comes down, we're going to point the chuck towards that hip. And we're going to aim to just bounce it off the side of the hip. So from here, we're coming down and bouncing it, okay? Down, bouncing it, let it come out again, down, bounce, out. Okay, so from over the shoulder, just going to come down to the side and bounce it off. Okay, again guys, the same with the over the shoulder redirects. We're looking at finding that bouncing point which will bounce the chuck back off in the other direction. So don't be worried here if you spend a little bit of time trying to find that bouncing point. The bouncing point is different for every person and is different for every pair of chucks that you use. So take a little bit of time to try and find that really good bouncing point. So once you've got that bounce and the chuck is coming out nicely, okay, we're going to look now at drawing a semicircle around the front of us. Okay, so we're looking at drawing a semicircle. So as soon as that chuck hits the bounce, okay, as soon as it hits that bounce on the hip, with the chuck pointing down, we're just going to draw a semicircle, which is going to bring the chuck around our body. Okay, so we've come from that over the shoulder, we've come down onto that hip, it's bounced, and we just draw a semicircle in front of us. When we draw that semicircle, it's going to whip the chuck over into the other side. Hopefully when you've got that bounce looking really good and you nail that semicircle, we should get something that looks a little bit like this. So from over the shoulder, bounce, semicircle, okay? Over the shoulder, bounce, draw that semicircle. Once you get that semicircle really good, draw the semicircle and stop it at the opposite hip there, okay? So we come over, bounce, semicircle, stop. So we're over the shoulder, bounce, semicircle, stop. And we should get this. Okay, so we're over, bounce, semicircle, stop. So now what we want to look at is getting a good bounce from one side to the other. So we can use this in our forms or any of our nunchuck performances. Maybe if we just need to get a little bit of time, getting a little bit of time, think about what our next move's going to be. We can use this motion to keep the chucks moving whilst we think about what we're going to move into next. So we're going to be looking at now keeping that bounce from side to side. So once we're over the shoulder and we've got that good bounce semicircle stop, we're going to be looking at getting the good bounce from that other hip as well. So we should be able to go bouncing from side to side and keeping that nunchuck moving. We've already got a good bounce on this side. We've drawn that semicircle and stopped, and now we're looking at bouncing again off this side. So we can go from one side to the next just by drawing that semicircle in front of us and finding that perfect bounce point from each side. So eventually you can get it going quicker and quicker and quicker. Don't panic, guys, if you can't get it going too quick with these redirects. Again, like I said in previous lessons, these are speed chucks. They're designed to be moved a lot quicker than your normal chucks. Hopefully most of you are learning with foam chucks, so it's going to keep it a lot safer than learning with metal chucks or wooden chucks. Now, the foam chucks with longer rope will take longer to transition on the redirects, but don't panic at this point. All you need to be doing is focusing on getting that really good technique and making sure you make your chucks work for you. So really quickly, I just want to talk through the different planes that we can work in when we're doing a nunchuck performance. These planes will be transitioning between the different ways you can move your nunchucks based on where people are watching the performance from. I'll give you a little example now. So imagine you're watching from where the camera is and I'm doing an outside spin. Now it does look good. It looks okay from there. The outside spin's looking good. And it's a good performance. I mean, you can watch it for a little while if you were stood in front of the nunchuck. But what if you were stood in that direction? And it would look more like this. Now these planes become a little bit more obvious when we start using two chucks, because when we use two chucks, we can actually hit them off beat, which makes the performance look incredible. I'll give you a quick example of that now. So if we were in front, guys, and we were just doing those outside spins, it looks good. Even if I take them off beat, it looks good, okay? Now look at it from the other side, okay? So we're spinning those chucks, and then we decide to take it off beat, back into beat, off beat, back into beat. Now you couldn't see that off beat too good from the front, but from the side, it looked absolutely amazing. So those planes of motion and the different ways we can spin the chucks aren't too important just at this point, but what I did want to explain it for is so that you guys know that if you're showing someone your chucku skills, try and see how it will look from those different angles and adjust where you're standing to give them the best performance. So we've just finished doing our hours and hours and hours of practice on those hip redirects, and we're getting something that would look a little something like this. Now what we got to look at doing, guys, is transitioning to the different plane and coming back up over into those shoulder redirects. Now it's really quite a tricky one to try and figure out, but once you're over the shoulder and you've got the bounces good on the hips, once we hit the hip that's on the same side as the chuck, we can just whip it back over our shoulder. So remember, wherever we point this end of the chuck, the other end will follow. So we've got our hip redirects. As soon as we hit that outside hip, we're just going to direction the chuck back up over into that over shoulder redirect. So we're here, As soon as we bounce from this hip, we're changing the plane and coming over our shoulder. So eventually, we'll be able to come up over the shoulder, back into that starting point, start the bounces again over the shoulder. So we're bouncing over the shoulder, using that shoulder redirect from our previous lessons, back into the hip redirects over the shoulder. So all you're going to do now, guys, is you're just going to practice with those shoulder redirects again, transition across into those hip redirects, and transition back into those shoulder redirects until you get the motion really, really fluid. So now we've had a little bit of time to practice the hip redirects, we're going to add that cool little spin in there now. So what we want to be looking at is being really fluid with this motion. As soon as we're fluid with this motion, we're going to add that full circle in and come back into that hip redirect. So what we need to start with, guys, is start with the chuck here. We can hold it here to keep the chuck up, and we're just going to spin it out. It's going to spin around once, and it's going to come back into that opposite hip. So we bounce, spin into that hip. For now, just practice holding the chuck on the side, spinning it and stopping it, okay? Back to holding the chuck, spinning it and stopping it. Use this hand to help get that little extra motion into the spin if you need to at the moment, and just spin it round and stop it, okay? We're here, and we just spin around and stop. From the other side, spin around and stop. Do go careful at this point, guys, if you've got a longer chain or longer rope, and make sure you come out far enough so that it doesn't hit you in the stomach or end up hitting you in the elbows, until eventually we get the bounce into that other hip. So you've probably noticed that when we hold the chuck in our normal grip but pointing down, that for our first redirects, when we're just going from hip to hip, all we're drawing is a semicircle. And what that does is it spins the chuck out and allows us to stop it on the other side. Now what we're doing in this move is we're drawing a full circle, which allows the chuck to come all the way around and into that other hip. So instead of just drawing that semicircle, we're drawing a full circle. So instead of the semicircle, we're drawing a full circle. Imagine this chuck is the pen, and we're just drawing that circle. It's going to allow the chuck to spin in that full circle. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add all those moves together and create a really fluid movement. So we've got comfortable here, and we've got comfortable with that strike across the body into that hip. We've also got comfortable with the hip redirects and going from side to side. And we've also got comfortable with coming from our nunchuck side over our shoulder. So now we want to practice getting that motion really fluid. And when that motion is really fluid, add that spin in. So go and spin over the shoulder. Hip, spin, hip, over the shoulder. Until eventually you're just doing it as it's second nature, and you don't even need to think about the motion of the chuck, because your muscles are remembering what you need to do and you're just doing it naturally. So now what we can do is we can add lesson 1 and 2 into this lesson and use all the moves together. So we're taking our figure of 8 from our lesson 1, our shoulder redirects from lesson 2, and adding in the hip redirects from the lesson we just done. We can also do that figure of 8, shoulder redirects, hip, spin, hip. Figure of 8, shoulder redirects, hip, spin, hip. All the way around, and finish it off with that catch. So I'll quickly give you a demonstration on what we will be learning in lesson 4.